Did you know that the largest aerial battle in World War II involved over 400 aircraft in a single day? A sky filled with screaming engines, tracer rounds, and life-or-death decisions. This was no mere clash, it was a thunderstorm of steel and fire. In the skies above the Pacific, war took on a new shape. Wings of steel sliced through the clouds, and history was written in fire. These weren't just battles, they were duels in the heavens. One wrong move meant death, one lucky shot, immortality. This is the story of the skies, the fury, the fear, and the fight for the future. Welcome to the deadliest dogfights of World War II. This was a collision of two great powers, Japan and the United States, each betting everything on the strength of their carriers, the precision of their pilots, and the power of their planes. Over the course of just 2 days, more than 1,500 aircraft would be launched into the skies. Some never returned. Many never had a chance. Let's understand why the Pacific War went airborne. It began with fire raining from the sky. On December 7, 1941, the rising sun crested over Oahu, and with it came the scream of engines and the shriek of destruction. Japanese carrier-based aircraft, in a stunning display of precision and audacity, tore through the skies above Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned, airfields were reduced to craters, and over 2,400 Americans perished in under 2 hours. The world changed that morning. What had once been a distant war suddenly ignited into a global inferno, and for the United States, the Pacific Ocean was now a battlefield of survival. Japan, drunk on early victories and driven by its imperial ambitions, swept through the Pacific like a tidal wave. Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, the Philippines, each fell like dominoes. Japan's strategy was simple: strike first, strike fast, and dominate the sea through air. Control the skies and you control the islands. Control the islands and you strangle your enemy before they can even fight back. But what Japan didn't count on was America's answer to their blitz from above. What the Japanese Zero had been in 1941, the American aircraft carrier would become by 1942. A symbol of vengeance, resilience, and technological rebirth. The age of the battleship died at Pearl Harbor. From its ashes rose the flat tops, floating fortresses capable of projecting power across thousands of miles. No longer would the outcome of war be decided by dreadnoughts trading shells on the horizon. It would be written in vapor trails, aerial duels, and the deafening roar of radial engines at 20,000 feet. The Pacific Theater became a proving ground for a new kind of warfare, where speed, altitude, and firepower ruled the day. And at the heart of it all was one word: air superiority. The vastness of the Pacific, an ocean that covered more than 60 million square miles, made traditional ground warfare impractical and slow. Every island captured became a stepping stone, every runway a launch pad, every aircraft a spearhead. With each island secured, the U.S. inched closer to Japan, narrowing the kill zone while expanding its reach. Aircraft weren't just scouts or escorts anymore, they were the main event. A single carrier group could unleash hundreds of sorties, crippling enemy infrastructure, softening beach defenses, and even sinking enemy fleets before they could fire a shot. The war had gone vertical, and Japan, once masters of the air, were now racing to keep up. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the skies were once a domain of supremacy. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was light, agile, and deadly in the hands of an experienced pilot. But by 1943, the cracks were beginning to show. American engineers, spurred by necessity, churned out newer, faster, tougher fighters, like the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair. These planes could outclimb, outdive, and outshoot the Japanese workhorses. American pilots were also better trained, better equipped, and rotating through combat at a rate Japan couldn't sustain. More importantly, America's industrial might was shifting into high gear. While Japan struggled to replace lost aircraft and veteran air crews, the U.S. was producing planes by the thousands and training pilots in every corner of the nation. The rise of the U.S. aircraft carrier was not just about steel and speed. It was about mobility, vision, and domination. These floating air bases could strike from anywhere, vanish into the horizon, and reappear with a vengeance. Battles like Coral Sea, Midway, and the Eastern Solomons weren't won by brute force. They were won by superior reconnaissance, faster launch times, better coordination, and air power. The victory at Midway alone, where 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, changed the entire trajectory of the war, proving that the sky, not the sea, was now the battlefield. By 1944, this doctrine had matured into a war machine. Carrier task forces became the tip of the spear, launching synchronized assaults across vast distances, sometimes 300 miles from the enemy. Fighter squadrons escorted torpedo bombers into the heart of enemy defenses, engaging enemy aircraft in dogfights that spiraled down like burning stars. Bombers cratered airfields, sank destroyers, and paved the way for amphibious landings. Japan, lacking radar, coordination, and fuel, was slowly being bled from above. Every Japanese airfield that fell into American hands became another nail in the empire's coffin. And yet, the stakes kept rising. With each battle came lessons, faster launch protocols, better bombing runs, tighter formations. By the time the U.S. reached the Marianas, they weren't just fighting for another patch of land, they were aiming to bring Tokyo into bombing range. The carriers weren't just weapons of war anymore. They were launch platforms for the end game. The sky had become a chessboard, and America now controlled. The Pacific War had gone airborne not by chance, but by brutal necessity. It was a war where geography demanded innovation, where oceans demanded mobility, and where victory demanded the skies. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippine Sea, the war was won not just on beaches or in bunkers, but in dogfights, bombing runs, and aerial supremacy. The Empire of Japan had awoken the giant, but they never expected the thunder to come from above. The planes, weapons of the dogfight. In the skies above the Pacific, it wasn't just nations that clashed. It was machines. Streamlined, roaring, and deadly, the aircraft of World War II became avatars of strategy, engineering, and national will. But not all planes were created equal. In the early days of the war, Japan ruled the skies with the Mitsubishi A6M0, a marvel of aviation at the time. With unmatched agility, a blistering hop speed of over 330 miles per hour, and an exceptional range of nearly 2,000 miles, the Zero was the terror of the Pacific. It could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver nearly every opponent. Pilots who flew it felt like gods of the air, light, fast, and almost untouchable. But that illusion came with a price. What the Zero had in speed and finesse, it sorely lacked in protection. Its lightweight frame, the very thing that made it dance through dogfights, was its greatest weakness. It had no armor to shield the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent fires. A single burst of gunfire could shred it. And as the war dragged on, that vulnerability became a death sentence. The Americans had taken a brutal beating early in the war, but in the wake of Pearl Harbor, their war machine awakened with thunderous resolve. Out of the factories of Grumman and Vought came 2 aircraft that would rewrite the rules of engagement: the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair. The Hellcat was a beast, heavier, more durable, and packing serious firepower with 650 caliber Browning machine guns. It wasn't as nimble as the Zero, but it didn't have to be. The Hellcat could absorb damage, dive at blistering speed, and climb fast enough to dictate the fight. With better armor and more survivability, American pilots no longer had to fight on the Zero's terms. Then came the Corsair, nicknamed Whistling Death by the Japanese. Its distinctive gull-wing design and monstrous 2,000 horsepower engine made it one of the fastest propeller-driven planes of the war. It could hit over 400 miles per hour and carry rockets, bombs, and more ammo than the Zero could ever dream of. While it had a reputation early on for being tricky to land on carriers, its performance in air-to-air combat was savage and overwhelming. These differences in design forced a fundamental shift in aerial tactics. Japanese pilots trained in aggressive close-range dogfighting, fast turns, tight maneuvers, and ambushes from above. Early in the war, that worked, The Zero's lack of armor meant even one hit from a Hellcat could set it ablaze. It couldn't dive away. Its structure would shear apart. It couldn't outgun its opponents. And increasingly, it couldn't outrun them either. The Americans adapted. Pilots were trained to exploit the Zero's blind spots and weaknesses. They stopped trying to turn with the enemy and instead used boom and zoom tactics, diving from high altitude, blasting through with heavy fire, and escaping before the enemy could react. They fought smarter, not harder, using their superior durability, speed in a dive, and coordinated formations to dominate the skies. The result? By mid-1944, the kill ratios were staggering. In some battles, Hellcats were achieving 19-to-1 kill ratios against the Zero. In the Mariana Turkey Shoot alone, American pilots claimed over 300 Japanese planes in a single day. It was a clash of philosophies: speed versus survivability, maneuverability versus firepower. And in the end, the brutal arithmetic of war favored the side that could build, fly, and fight longer. The skies of the Pacific weren't just blue. They were filled with smoke trails, flaming wreckage, and the echoes of screaming engines. The Hellcat and the Corsair didn't just win air superiority, they changed the fate of a war. And for every pilot who climbed into one, the sky became both a battleground and a reckoning. Tactics in the sky, how dogfights played out in the unforgiving skies of the Pacific. Dogfights weren't just battles, they were chess matches fought at 400 miles per hour. Every maneuver, every turn, every dive was a gamble between life and death. High above the endless blue expanse, the tactics of air warfare evolved into a deadly dance, one shaped not just by machines but by the pilots who flew them and the doctrines that trained them. At the heart of it all were two dominant styles of aerial combat: turn fighting and boom and zoom. For the Japanese, turn fighting was gospel. Their aircraft, especially the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, were built for agility. Light and responsive, these planes could twist through the air like smoke, making tight turns to get behind their enemies for the kill. Japanese pilots trained for years to perfect this art, learning to read an enemy's movement and exploit even the smallest mistake. In the early days, this doctrine gave them a terrifying edge. Against slower, less maneuverable American aircraft, they danced through battle with deadly grace. But the war wasn't static, and the Americans were quick to adapt. Enter boom and zoom, a brutal tactic pioneered by U.S. pilots flying sturdier, faster aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair. Instead of trying to match the Zero's tight turns, American pilots would climb to higher altitude, dive down at blistering speed, unleash devastating firepower, and then climb back out of range before the enemy could react. It was rather than dogfight in a traditional sense, boom and zoom turned the skies into a kill zone, where speed and altitude meant survival. But tactics alone weren't enough. As the Pacific War intensified, so too did the complexity of air combat. It was no longer just about duels between fighters. Entire fleets now coordinated dogfights like symphonies of destruction. American carrier groups began using early radar systems, detecting incoming waves of enemy aircraft long before they reached visual range. Fighter direction officers aboard carriers relayed positions, guiding interceptors like Hellcats to strike formations before they could reach the fleet. Combat air patrols, CAPs, were born, rings of fighters circling overhead, ready to swarm any threat. Below them, American ships created terrifying flak zones, walls of anti-aircraft fire that turned the skies into infernos. Japanese pilots attempting to break through to the carriers faced coordinated resistance, radar-guided intercepts, layered squadrons, and fields of exploding shrapnel. For every mile they closed in, the cost was blood. And yet, as Japan's aerial capabilities waned, desperation bred a terrifying new tactic, one that broke every rule of war: the kamikaze. By late 1944, Japan's once mighty Air Force had been decimated. Their veteran pilots were gone, their planes outdated, their industrial base shattered, but their will to resist remained unbroken. From this despair rose the kamikaze, divine wind. It wasn't about dogfighting anymore. It was about sacrifice. Young men, barely trained, were loaded into planes stripped of everything but fuel and explosives. Their mission was simple: die by crashing into an American ship. No escape, no return, just fire and steel. For the Americans, this was an entirely new kind of threat, unpredictable, relentless, and psychologically devastating. Kamikazes didn't play by the rules. They didn't retreat. They didn't hesitate. They turned every alarm into a countdown, every dot on the radar into a potential funeral. Entire task forces would go on high alert at the first sign of inbound aircraft. Gunners fired blindly into the sky, and fighter squadrons scrambled furiously to intercept planes that would never break off. And yet, despite the chaos, the U.S. Navy adapted again. Fleet formations tightened, combat air patrols thickened, radar detection improved, and above all, American pilots, now seasoned by years of brutal combat, learned to read the sky like a battlefield map. What began as an uneven contest between fragile planes and raw tactics had evolved into a theater of precision warfare. Altitude, timing, communication, everything had to align perfectly. Pilots became tacticians, gunners became guardians, and the sea itself became a fortress defended not just by steel and fire, but by the mastery of the air. Because in the Pacific, survival didn't belong to the fastest plane, it belonged to famous battles with intense dogfights. Before the roar of jet engines and the missiles of the Cold War, the Pacific skies were ruled by propellers and machine guns. And in this deadly theater of the Second World War, 3 battles stood above the rest, each a turning point, each soaked in sweat, smoke, and sacrifice. These were not just clashes of steel and strategy. They were full-blown aerial brawls where the future of the Pacific was decided in the blink of an eye. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 changed everything. For the first time in naval history, enemy ships never saw each other. The battle was fought entirely by aircraft launched from carriers. It was a high-stakes experiment in a new kind of warfare. Japan had aimed to cut off Australia by seizing Port Moresby, but the U.S. Navy, with its fleet carriers Lexington and Yorktown, intercepted them. What followed was a brutal game of cat and mouse, with American and Japanese squadrons searching for each other over hundreds of miles of open ocean. When they met, the skies erupted in chaos. Dive bombers screamed down from the clouds. Anti-aircraft guns roared from below. The Lexington was lost, but so was Japan's carrier Shoho. It wasn't a clear victory for either side, but it marked the end of Japan's unchecked expansion. And more importantly, it showed that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would now dominate naval warfare. Then came the Battle of Midway just a month later, a clash so pivotal it rewrote the balance of power in the Pacific. The Japanese came with overwhelming force, 4 carriers, hundreds of planes, and a plan to ambush the weakened U.S. fleet. But what they didn't know was that American cryptographers had broken their code. The U.S. Navy knew they were coming, and they were ready. The early hours of June 4th, 1942, saw wave after wave of American torpedo bombers strike at the heart of the Japanese formation. Many of them shot down before they could get close. But then, at the perfect moment, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown appeared over the horizon. In less than 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. A 4th, Hiryu, would follow by day's end. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of elite pilots was a blow from which Japan would never truly recover. From Midway on, Japan would fight a defensive war, and America would take the initiative. But it was in June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, that American air dominance reached its peak, in what became known as the Mariana Turkey Shoot. With the U.S. pushing toward the Mariana Islands, Japan launched one last massive aerial counterattack. Over 450 planes, many piloted by green recruits. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre.
The Japanese planes were outdated,
Their tactics predictable, and their pilots vastly undertrained. The sky became a graveyard. Over 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in just 2 days, most without inflicting any significant damage. The lopsidedness was staggering. One American pilot radioed, "This is like an old-time turkey shoot." The nickname stuck, and so did the symbolism. This was the moment Japan lost its last hope of challenging U.S. air superiority. From the Coral Sea's cautious experimentation, to Midway's tide-turning ambush, to the utter dominance of the Mariana turkey shoot. Each of these battles tells the story of how air power reshaped naval warfare forever. It was no longer about who had the biggest guns, but who could strike first from the sky, who could control the air above the fleet, and who could adapt faster in the swirling chaos of aerial combat. In the Pacific, the dogfight wasn't just a tactic, it was the war. Pilot POV, stories from the cockpit. High above the Pacific, where the clouds were torn apart by propellers and tracer fire, war was personal. It wasn't fought on maps or in war rooms. It lived inside the cockpits of young men who stared death in the face at 20,000 feet. These weren't just soldiers, they were sky warriors, strapped into thin aluminum coffins, praying their engine wouldn't stall, or that the next burst of flak wouldn't be the last thing they ever saw. The life expectancy of a World War II fighter pilot in the Pacific, sometimes just 4 weeks. One mission, one mistake, one lucky shot from an enemy gun. That's all it took, and they knew it. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, once took off with just a few gallons of fuel left and gunned down 9 Japanese planes in a single mission. He returned to the Essex running on fumes, his hands trembling. He later wrote, "I didn't think I was coming back that day. I just kept firing until I had nothing left but sky." And yet, he survived, when so many others did not. Japanese pilots wrote in diaries of their duty, honor, and dread. A 22-year-old Zero pilot, just days before his final flight, wrote, "I fly for the Emperor, but I fear the silence before battle. It is like death is already watching." He never returned. His body was never found. Just another soul swallowed by the endless blue. The cockpits were hot, cramped, and deafening. Communication was choppy. Oxygen ran thin. Pilots wore bulky flight suits soaked in sweat and fuel, scanning every angle of sky for an enemy closing in. One Hellcat pilot described it as flying through hell with the devil behind you and no brakes. Every pilot had a close call, or several. One American Corsair pilot, shot up and trailing smoke, had to ditch in open ocean. "The water hit like concrete," he wrote. "I thought that was it. But somehow, I came up. A destroyer picked me up 40 minutes." Survival wasn't just about skill. It was about luck. About who spotted who first. About whose wingman covered their 6. About which engine coughed at the wrong moment. In the closing days of the war, desperation gripped Japanese pilots. Many were barely trained. Some were teenagers sent on one-way missions. Kamikaze units were born, a terrifying testament to sacrifice. A captured Japanese pilot, barely 19, sobbed during interrogation, whispering, "They told me it was the only way to bring honor to my family." But for many American flyers, there was no glory in killing, only duty. Some still remember the faces of the enemy, not as monsters, but as boys like them. "I shot down a Zero and saw the canopy come off," one veteran recalled, voice cracking decades later. "He waved before he went in, just waved. I still see it in my dreams." Inside those cockpits were human beings, terrified, determined, barely out of high school, fighting not for conquest, but survival, fighting for their comrades, for the ones who didn't make it home. The dogfights might seem glamorous in old films, loops, rolls, smoke trails, but up there, it was chaos. Metal tearing, radios screaming, engines burning, and the sound of your own heart pounding so hard you thought it might shatter your ribs. In every bullet hole, every cracked windshield, every trembling hand gripping the stick lived a story, a prayer, a moment of humanity in the most inhuman of places. And when the guns finally fell silent, the skies held their secrets. The tide turns, American dominance. By late 1944, the tides of war in the Pacific had shifted, not just slightly, but with the weight of an unstoppable industrial machine crashing against a crumbling empire. What had once been a desperate struggle for survival after Pearl Harbor had now become a relentless push toward victory. And at the heart of it all was the sky. America's industrial might had awakened like a sleeping giant. Aircraft factories roared day and night, pumping out Hellcats, Corsairs, Avengers, and B-29s with terrifying speed. Where Japan could build tens, the United States built hundreds. Where Japan trained pilots for years, America streamlined its programs, producing thousands of skilled aviators who knew how to fly, fight, and survive. The war had become a numbers game, and Japan was running out of cards. New U.S. training programs were brutal but efficient. Pilots practiced in simulators, trained in mock dogfights, and studied enemy tactics before ever facing combat. The era of trial and error flying was over. American pilots were entering battle smarter, faster, and deadlier. Veteran aces returned home to teach fresh squadrons, passing on the hard-earned lessons of Midway and Guadalcanal. Tactics evolved, formations tightened, communication improved, and aggressive ambush maneuvers became standard. Meanwhile, Japan's once formidable Air Force was hemorrhaging talent. Their best pilots, those who had dominated the skies early in the war, were now either dead or too injured to fly. Desperate for replacements, Japan rushed teenagers into cockpits with barely enough training to land, let alone dogfight. These young men were brave, but bravery couldn't match experience or armor or firepower. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, it was no longer a contest. The skies were American. What followed was a massacre so one-sided, it earned a chilling nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days, U.S. pilots shot down over 600 Japanese planes, gutting what remained of Japan's air fleet. American pilots returned to their carriers almost untouched. The Japanese never recovered. Facing annihilation, Japan turned to a weapon of desperation, the kamikaze. The word meant divine wind, a reference to the typhoons that had once saved Japan from Mongol invasion centuries ago. Now it became a final tragic cry from a nation on the brink. Young men were asked to give up everything, to climb into planes packed with explosives and crash into American ships. There was no survival, no second mission, no coming home. It was the ultimate sacrifice. And thousands answered the call. But even kamikaze warfare could not change the momentum. For every American ship struck, dozens more launched. For every man lost, more arrived, better trained, better armed, and burning with resolve. In the air, U.S. dominance was now total. Bombing raids devastated Japanese infrastructure. Carrier groups roamed the Pacific like steel fortresses, each one a mobile airbase with the power to erase entire islands. Tokyo itself came under fire, and everywhere American bombers flew, fighter escorts followed, an iron shield of Hellcats and Mustangs that tore through any remaining resistance. The Pacific War had gone airborne, and America owned the sky. Yet amid all the fire and thunder, a quiet truth lingered. The cost was staggering. Thousands of American pilots would never return. Families waited by radios, praying for letters that would never come. Japanese cities burned, oceans became graveyards, and still, the planes kept flying. The tide had turned, but victory would not come cheap. What these dogfights meant. When the smoke cleared and the wreckage sank into the Pacific, the world had changed. Not just in borders and empires, but in the very fabric of warfare itself. These dogfights, once viewed as mere tactical support for boots on the ground or naval gunfire, had reshaped the soul of naval warfare. No longer were battles decided solely by battleships exchanging shells over the horizon. Now, the true power of a navy rested in the steel decks of aircraft carriers, floating fortresses that launched wings of death into the sky. The age of the carrier had begun, and the battles of Midway, Coral Sea, and the Philippine Sea had written it. Japan, in the Battle of the Philippine Sea alone, lost over 600 aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. Planes spiraled into the ocean like falling stars. Others crashed into carriers or vanished into the clouded horizon. Many of the downed pilots never had a chance to fire a shot. They were young, brave, and woefully undertrained. The ranks of Japan's elite aviators were gutted, their experience lost forever in waves that swallowed metal and flesh without a trace. On the American side, though losses did occur, the scale paled in comparison. With factories in full swing back home and new squadrons constantly arriving, the U.S. could replace its losses. Japan could not. Each Japanese plane shot down wasn't just hardware destroyed, it was a dagger in the heart of Japan's already strained war machine. But perhaps the most lasting wound wasn't physical. It was psychological. The myth of Japanese aerial supremacy, forged in the surprise of Pearl Harbor and the early dominance of the Zero fighter, was shattered. The invincible Japanese air arm had been humiliated in front of the world, their skies ripped open by waves of American Hellcats and Corsairs. In Japan, morale withered. Civilians who once saw their fighter pilots as modern-day samurai now mourned them as martyrs. Newspapers couldn't hide the truth. Cities lived in fear of the approaching firestorms. Children practiced air raid drills while the sound of distant engines became the prelude to death from above. In America, though victory was in sight, the cost haunted returning veterans. Pilots who survived countless missions often couldn't shake the images burned into their memories. The enemy planes that burst into flames mid-air, the silence that followed a wingman's final radio call, the ocean littered with parachutes that never opened. Many never spoke of it again. These dogfights didn't just win battles, they redefined them. They taught the world that air superiority wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Control of the skies meant control of the war. And for the first time in history, wars could be won before an enemy even saw the face of their attacker. In the decades to follow, militaries across the globe would model their navies, air forces, and doctrines around what happened in the Pacific. Technology advanced, strategies evolved, and the ghostly silhouettes of Hellcats and Zeros would become legends, studied, revered, and never forgotten. What did these dogfights mean? They meant the end of an era and the beginning of a terrifying airborne future. They meant thousands of lives traded for inches of ocean. They meant courage, sacrifice, and sorrow, etched in the sky forever. The Pacific was no longer just water. It was memory. It was legacy. And it still echoes with the roar of engines and the cries of men who once ruled its skies. Long after the gunfire ceased and the aircraft wreckage was claimed by the deep, the battles fought in the skies over the Pacific left behind more than just victory, they left a blueprint. A blueprint that would define the very future of warfare. The daring dogfights, the brutal carrier assaults, and the shift to air dominance forever altered how nations would wage war. It was here, above those turquoise waters, that modern air combat was born, fast, coordinated, and unforgiving. As the Cold War dawned, military leaders in Washington and Moscow studied the Pacific theater with obsessive precision. The tactics pioneered during the island-hopping campaigns became gospel in flight academies. The importance of first strike air dominance, of radar coordinates, of pilot endurance under fire. These were no longer just lessons from the past. They were the foundations of survival in a nuclear age. The skies had become the new front line, and dogfights over Saipan and Midway were treated not as relics, but as previews of what future wars could look like. Fighter technology evolved rapidly. Swept wings replaced straight lines. Jets replaced props. But the DNA of every F-86 Sabre and MiG-15, the very heart of every supersonic machine that would streak across Cold War skies, could be traced back to the screaming engines of the Hellcats, Zeros, and Corsairs that once dueled at 20,000 feet. Today, the echoes of those battles live on, not just in history books, but in the steel and glass halls of aviation museums around the world. Preserved aircraft, scarred by time, sit like sleeping titans. The Mitsubishi A6M0 with its haunting agility, the F6F Hellcat with its brutish power, the Corsair's signature gull wings casting long shadows over polished hangar floors. These aren't just machines, they are monuments. Monuments to a generation that flew into the unknown and rewrote the rules of combat. And it's not just machines that survived, it's memories. Veterans, now in their twilight years, still share their stories in documentaries, interviews, and oral histories. Their voices crack with age, but their words remain razor-sharp. Memories of barrel rolls, flak bursts, oil smoke trails, and radio calls that were sometimes cut off mid-word. They speak of fear, of courage, of losing friends in seconds. And always, always, they speak with pride. Not for what they destroyed, but for what they protected. Modern air forces, whether flying stealth fighters or unmanned drones, still study the Pacific dogfights for their raw, human clarity. Technology may have changed, but the essence of air combat remains unchanged. The duel of wits, nerves, and reflexes above a world that watches from below. Simulators recreate Midway. Tactical briefings dissect the Marianas turkey shoot. Young pilots wear the same. It is the relentless pursuit of superiority through speed, precision, and innovation. It is the belief that who controls the skies controls the war. It is a legacy of honor, forged in fire, carried on wings, and passed through generations of aviators who still whisper stories of the Zero, the Hellcat, and the men who flew them. The war ended, the planes landed, the battles faded, but the legacy? It never stopped flying. They soared through flak and fire, through storm clouds and silence, chasing enemies they could barely see, defending skies that only history would remember. These pilots, many no older than today's college students, wrote their courage in vapor trails and burning horizons. Some returned as legends, others vanished into the blue forever. But all of them left their mark above the Pacific, in the clouds, in the water, in the legacy of air power that shapes our world to this day. As the echoes of those dogfights fade into the past, one truth remains. Bravery in the skies was never about glory. It was about grit, sacrifice, and the will to never back down. If these forgotten battles, these skybound stories of courage and sacrifice stir something in you, then join us. Subscribe and fly with us again as we uncover the untold, the unseen, and the unforgettable chapters of war history, like you've never seen them before. This is war. This is legacy. This is just the beginning.